Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. And you can see today's topic is part 2 of our talk on Industrial Revolution. Now, as always, take a moment, hit pause on this video, jot down that lecture outline to your right, and pay particular attention to those key terms at your left. You got it? Let's get started. Now, we left off talking about the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution in Europe. And we said England went first, in large part because they were, as an island nation, they are able to escape kind of the warfare going on the mainland. But the rest of Europe is going to begin to develop, industrialize, following the final demise of Napoleon after 1815. And so while they are behind England, they're not that far behind. Again, Britain started in about 1780s, and the rest of mainland Europe in about 1815. Now, much like in Britain, throughout much of the continental Europe, the cottage industry is going to thrive in many regions. Some of those British manufacturing techniques will be copied by continental countries. But up until 1815, the Napoleonic Wars had hindered the growth of industrialization on the continental European nations, because the wars disrupted trade, created runaway inflation, reduced consumer demand. But by 1815, those continental countries were lagging behind than they would have been otherwise, thanks to all these wars. And the result was Britain dominated the markets during the Napoleonic Wars. British technology was just too advanced for most continental engineers and skilled technicians to understand. Technologies like steam power was expensive and required large amounts of capital that were being diverted to war. There was a shortage of factory workers as men were being put off to war. But after 1815, continental Europe began to catch up with Britain. They studied Britain's costly mistakes during early industrialization period and avoided them. And they will all begin to industrialize, though at different rates in times. Now, Belgium, Holland, France, and the United States would begin their industrial revolutions in the second decade of the 19th century, that was around the 1820s. Germany, Austria, Italy, around the mid-1800s. By 1900, Germany was the most powerful industrial nation in Europe. Eastern Europe and Russia will not industrialize until the end of the 1800s. What they're going to do, though, is borrow technology, borrow British engineers, hire them away, and gain British capital. They will use the strong, powerful, sovereign central governments and banking systems to promote native industry. For instance, in Belgium, in the 1830s, they will pioneer the organization of big corporations with many stockholders. Understand, this is in Belgium, 1830s. The United States won't do this until the 1870s. These banks will use money to develop industries and thus became industrial banks. They became industrial capitalists, investment capitalists. Banks in France and Germany became important in the 1850s by developing railroads and for companies in heavy industries, including Crédit Mobilier of Paris becoming the most famous. And they will help fund and build railroads all over France and indeed all of Europe. By the mid-1800s, Britain became unsuccessful in maintaining a monopoly on technical advances. Now, up until 1825, it was illegal for artisans and skilled mechanics to leave Britain. Until 1843, the export of textile machinery and other equipment was forbidden. But, despite these laws, many would emigrate illegally and introduce these new methods abroad, helping continental Europe to catch up. The tariff policies were used to protect native industries on the continent. But France responded by invoking their own high tariffs on many British imports. France had been flooded by inexpensive and superior British goods. And so by imposing tariffs on them, they were able to develop their own industry and begin to sell French goods. In 1834, the Zollverein, was a German tariff placed on non-German imports, encouraging capital investment in the German industry. Establishing a free trade zone along member states and a single uniform tariff would be levied against foreign countries, allowing them to develop their own industrial power. Now, despite all this, despite all the positives of technology and the growth of big business, there were, of course, some social implications. In fact, the traditional social hierarchy was going to be completely upended with a new social order. The 19th century became the golden age of the middle class. Two new levels of bourgeoisie existed. There were the upper bourgeois. These were the great bankers, the merchants, the industrialists who demanded free enterprise and high tariffs. And then there was the lower bourgeoisie, or petit bourgeois. These were small industrialists, merchants, and professional men who demanded stability and security from the government. But this also opened new opportunities for certain groups. Artisan and skilled workers who were highly talented could achieve tremendous, significant success. Certain ethnic and religious groups became successful, including the Quakers and Scots in England, and the Protestants, while the Protestants and Jews would dominate banking in Catholic France. As factories grew larger, opportunities for advancement declined in well-developed industry. Capital-intensive industry made it harder for skilled artisans to become wealthy manufacturers because they needed that startup capital. Formal education thus became more important as a means of social advancement, but was often cost prohibitive to those below the middle class. In England by 1830 and by Germany in 1860, lead industrialists were more likely to have inherited their businesses rather than self-starting. However, on the other hand, we have what are considered the proletariat, or your common wage workers. And for them, life was not so good. So while it did introduce a healthy middle class, and while it did create two new levels of bourgeois, the proletariat, the wage workers, the hourly workers, the factory workers, their life was often a living hell. Kids would work ridiculously long hours, including 13 and 14-hour days, 6 days a week, facing brutal discipline if they fall asleep. Mostly were poor and illiterate. Many were orphans from foundling hospitals. Understand what I mean here is that they are forcing child labor. Kids who are orphaned to work 13, 14-hour days, 6 days a week. And the discipline was beating. If you start falling asleep, they'll throw a bucket of cold water over your head. If you're lucky, it's cold water. If you're unlucky, it's the piss bucket from the corner where people were peeing in. Doors were often locked to prevent people from escaping or running away or taking a smoke break. These factory workers emerged as a new group in society in the fastest growing social class, aka the proletariat. During the first century of Industrial Revolution, a surplus of labor resulted in poor conditions for work. In other words, there was such a surplus of labor with so few jobs that they didn't need to treat workers well to keep them there. Poorhouses would emerge. The United States, we refer to them also as social workers. Poorhouses would emerge to provide work for those who were unemployed. These were often intentionally oppressive places. The major goal was to persuade workers to leave the poorhouse and find work elsewhere. Hey, we're going to help you out, but just treat like crap so we can force you to work somewhere else. And by 1844, Friedrich Engels will lash out at the middle class in his famous work, The Condition of the Working Class in England. He is a future revolutionary and colleague of Karl Marx, who believed that the capitalist middle class was ruthless and exploited the proletariat working class. He said very famously, quote, "I charge the English middle class with mass murder, wholesale robbery, and all the other crimes in the calendar," unquote. His ideas would greatly influence Karl Marx and later socialists. But these issues of the working class, the wages, the quality of life would lead to struggles between labor and capitalists. For workers and ordinary families, the long-term impact of the Industrial Revolution was more favorable than negative. They would see significant advancement in pattern of pre-industrial life. They would see material prosperity in England due to the availability of cheaper, high-quality goods, and because of increased consumption led to more jobs. Wages, real wages, in other words, wages that outpace inflation, will raise significantly between 1820 and 1850. And consumption of the average worker will raise by almost 50%, compared to just 5% increase between 1780 and 1820. Skilled British workers would earn about twice that of unskilled. However, the average work week also increased. Workers did eat better, and the quality and quantity of clothing improved. Housing did not improve, however. In fact, may have deteriorated by living in slums in the cities. But while these conditions did offer some improvement over previous eras of history, conditions in the factories were abysmal. And this would lead to clashes between workers and capitalists. And there would be a number of quote-unquote rebellions or uprisings or revolutions. The economic conditions of England, while technically improving, took a lot of work to get to that point. And it was the result of groups of people fighting for the rights of workers, including the Luddites. They were a violent group of irate workers who blamed industrialization for threatening their jobs. Beginning in 1812 and continuing thereafter, they would attack factories in northern England, destroying the new machinery that they believed were putting them out of work. Now, this is a more violent extreme, but what it would lead to is what we would refer to as the union movement, or the rise of unionization. Certain leaders began to organize workers to resist the exploitation of the proletariat by business owners. Now, back in 1799, the Parliament passed the Combination Acts that would prohibit labor unions. This was passed in reaction to the fear of radicalism caused by the French Revolution. But it was widely disregarded by workers, and in 1824, it was repealed. Unions became more tolerated and even legal. This would be led by Robert Owen, who in 1834 would organize the Grand National Consolidated Trade Union. He was a Scottish industrialist who pioneered industrial relations by combining firm discipline with the concern for the health, safety, and work hours of his workers. After 1815, he began to experiment with utopian cooperative and socialist communities. His and other unionization efforts failed, and Britain labor movement would once again begin to move toward the direction of craft unions after 1851. So there was attempts early on by Robert Owen to form a trade union. The problem is these often only represented those who were skilled. It still left the general proletariat unorganized. So after 1851, they began to once again move into craft unions as a way to organize the workers. Craft unions would win benefits for their workers, for their members. Now, were they wholesale huge changes? No, but they were bringing some benefits. Chartists would begin to seek out political democracy. They were organized in the face of Owen's National Trade Union collapse, and they demanded that all men would have the right to vote. They would seek to change what they saw as the oppressive economic system of exploitation. They championed 10-hour workdays to prevent duty-free imports of wheat into Britain to secure cheap bread. And with union action combined with the general prosperity and the development of social conscience would lead to the generalized improvement of working conditions, better wages, and even reduced work hours after 1850. Skilled labor benefited early and to a much larger extent than unskilled labor. So most of these early changes benefited those who were skilled that had the means to organize, compared to the unskilled mass proletariat. But we would begin to see a number of changes in the working condition. For instance, Factory work meant more discipline and loss of personal freedom. Work became impersonal. You were essentially a replaceable cog in the machine. And of course, as we mentioned earlier, this would increase the use of child labor, because child labor was seen as more exploitable. You could pay them less money, they were more easy to manipulate and more easy to exploit. And abandoned children became a main source of labor, as industrialists would clean out local parishes and orphanages. Children were doing much the same work as grown-ups were doing, and they had long done this. This was just a continuation of an old practice. But children alongside parents were working 12 to 14-hour days, and they would toil in the factories, in the mills together, husbands, fathers, mothers, children. The conditions were appalling. And children were sought after not only because they were cheap and exploitable, but because their small hands were more able to easily reach into the machines to try to fix, sprockets that had gotten jammed up. Of course, once they're got unjammed and the sprocket began to spin again, their hand gets nicked, or worse, fingers get cut off. And there would be some movements to try to reduce the effects of child labor, or to limit child labor. The Sadler Commission will investigate working conditions and help initiate legislation that will improve conditions in the factories. In 1833, Parliament will pass the Factory Act that will limit the workday of children aged 9 to 13 to just 8 hours per day, and limit the working hours of ages 14 to 18-year-olds to 12 hours. And it would prohibit hiring children under age 9. Children were required to go to elementary schools, and factory owners were required to establish those schools. Ironically, it would actually help destroy the pattern of families working together. But the employment of children would decline rapidly. And then finally, the Mines Act of 1842 would prohibit all boys and girls under the age of 10 from working underground. This would lead to significant social effects also. Urbanization was the most important sociological effect. It was the largest population transfer in human history. We could see the birth of new factory towns as cities grew into large industrial centers, places like Manchester. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, most people lived in the south of England. Coal and iron, however, in the Midlands and the north would push populations northward. By 1785, cities with more than 50,000 people, there are only 3 of them in England and Scotland. But by 1820, so notice this again, from 1785, there were just 3 cities with more than 50,000 people in England and Scotland. By 1820, just 35 years later, there were now 31 cities with 50,000 people or more. Now, let's be clear though. The role of the city changed things dramatically, from government to cultural centers to industrial centers. But although living conditions did not differ much from the farms, the concentration of the population in these cities made things seem much worse, because diseases spread more rapidly and people live in close quarters. And workers began to not only fight for their rights at the workplace, but also for political action to remedy their home life as well. Reformers sought to improve life in cities. Working class injustices, gender exploitation, and standard living issues became the 19th century great social and political dilemmas. The family structures and gender roles of the family were being altered as people began to spread out and work in different factories rather than together as family units. New wage economy meant that families were less closely bound to each other as they had been in the past. Productive work was taken out of the home and into the workspace of the factories. Men, women, children were separated in the workforce. Gender-determined roles at home and domestic life would emerge slowly. Married women became associated with domestic duties, while the men tended to be sole wage earners. Women were now expected to create a nurturing environment to which the family members returned after work. Married women worked outside the home only when the family needed it, due to illness or death of spouse required them to do so. Now, the Industrial Revolution may have stemmed human catastrophes from resulting from population growth. You see, overpopulation and rural poverty was most severe in Ireland. Ireland did not industrialize in the 19th century, and it stands as an example of what may have occurred in other parts of Europe had they not industrialized. So this is like a kind of case study right here. We can look to Ireland and see what may have happened if the rest of Europe had not industrialized in the face of a growing population. And of course, the result in Ireland was the famous or infamous Irish potato famine. Most of the population of Ireland were Irish Catholic peasants. They rented land from a tiny minority of Anglicans, many who lived in England. Most of them were living in abject poverty around 1800. The Protestant landlords did not improve agriculture in England as they were absentee landlords. The disease in the potato crop would continue to increase along with the accompanying fever epidemics. In 1845 and 1846, and then again in 1848 and 1851, the potato crop will fail in Ireland and much of Europe. Higher food prices, widespread suffering, and social unrest ensued. The result of this great famine was at least 1.5 million people died or went unborn. 1 million people fled Ireland between 1845 and 1851. 2 million left if you increase those years from 1840 to 1855. Most would go to the US or Britain. By 1911, Irish population stood at only 4.4 million, compared with 8 million back in 1845. In other words, while the population of Europe is increasing dramatically during the 1800s, the Irish population fell dramatically. Ireland had about 8 million people living there in 1845. But 1911, their population stood at just 4.4 million people. And, to be clear, the British government's response to this crisis was entirely inadequate. So, rapid population growth in Ireland without industrialization may have led to a similar crisis in other parts of Europe, such as happened in Ireland with the Irish potato famine. And we see this in other small areas. Central Russia, Western Germany, Southern Italy were extremely vulnerable to this. There was overpopulation, acute poverty, and a heavy reliance on a single staple crop, the potato. And so the question is, perhaps, despite all the horrors of industrialization as far as creating a proletariat underclass, it may have staved off something far worse. And there is a very worthy historical debate about whether or not the Industrial Revolution may actually have saved Europe and saved people's lives, despite creating new issues to deal with. Because the case of Ireland shows that without industrialization, the over-reliance of a single crop as a food staple, combined with abject high poverty rates, can cause a major catastrophe. And this is a cycle we see repeated in small pockets, whether Ireland, Central Russia, Western Germany, or Southern Italy, who had likewise acute poverty, a single potato crop staple for food, and a lack of industrialization. Now, so, the historical debate is, was the Industrial Revolution positive? Well, capitalists, of course, view it as a positive because it fulfilled human wants and needs. It provided power to replace back-breaking human labor. It provided wealth for human consumption. It provided vast amounts of food, clothing, and energy to be produced and distributed throughout the world. It provided luxuries that became commonplace. Life expectancy did increase. leisure time was made more enjoyable. And human catastrophe, like that happened in Ireland, was largely avoided in areas that experienced industrialization. On the other hand, that's what capitalists believe. Socialists and communists viewed it as just a new, further exploitation of the have-nots by the haves. Workers did not share in the dramatic increase in the standard of living until the second half of the 19th century due to low wages, poor working conditions, etc. And so during the first century of industrialization, the wealth created went almost exclusively to the entrepreneur and the owner of capital, the middle class, while the proletariat working class suffered mightily. So, was it a savior or was it just another rung in the long line of exploitation of the have-nots by the haves? It's a worthy debate to have. But until next time, take care and bye-bye.